It was a dark and rainy day in February when I was hit by a small red pickup. February 15th. I was told I flew 15 feet before landing smack on my head. Apparently, the driver was drunk and didn't see me crossing. I don't remember that day at all. 4 weeks I slept, in a coma that many feared I would never come out of. I was placed in a ward of children and teens with major bodily harm or disease. My roommate was a boy named Mason. I never did find out his last name. For the time in which I slept, he found out bits and pieces of me from my various visitors, my favorite color, what music I liked, and other random things. The day I woke up, I was showered with love and attention from my family, and it took me almost an hour to realize the presence of the boy laying in the bed beside me. He flashed me a lopsided grin and quietly went back to the book he was reading. Eventually, I was left in peace, and after about 20 minutes of mental debate, I spoke up and asked him his name. His voice was smooth and low, and never failed to make me shudder. We spent the rest of the evening playing 20 questions and becoming familiar with each other. Eventually, my doctor would break our quality time and give me the lowdown on my injuries and what the healing process would be like. He told me that when I was hit, not only did I give myself a nasty concussion, but my legs were also broken in my oh-so-graceful landing. They said I had a 60% chance of ever walking again. We became close instantaneously. The nurses would laugh and say we already looked like an old married couple bundled up in bed watching whatever soap opera happened to be on television. Mason would just flash me his trademark grin while I blushed and buried my face in his chest. We both had our good days and bad ones, Mason and I. On a particularly tough day of treatment for him, we both lay together with him trembling in my arms. I'll never forget the feeling of his soft hiccups or the knot at the pit of my stomach. I finally got up the courage and asked him the million-dollar question. He had Hodgkin's disease. I don't think either of us slept that night. While my legs were transitioned from casts to braces, Mason's chemotherapy began. However, without fail, when I'd come back frustrated or in tears over a difficult session of therapy, he'd be there to comfort me with soothing words and reruns of I Love Lucy. Over the weeks, the chemo began to take its toll. His brown curls thinned to almost nothing, dark circles took permanent residence under his eyes, and his skin turned as pale as snow. As my legs grew stronger, the day I was to be released no longer seemed like a thing to look forward to. The day we decided to shave his hair was the day I broke down. I told him I would do anything, give blood, bone marrow, anything to make him get better faster, but he just shot me a smile that instantly made me melt and wiped away my tears. 60%. Mason had a 60% chance of beating his demons. Same as me. On May 12th, I was officially released from room 104. I would walk with a limp most likely for the rest of my life. Every other day, I would visit Mason. Each time I would leave, we would take a picture together. Over the months, I could compare our first picture and our most recent one and see how much he was deteriorating. It was heartbreaking. August 17th was the first time I lost him. Overnight, a high fever had broken out, and his heart stopped for 4.5 minutes. Those were the worst minutes of my life. I sat outside his room in an uncomfortable plastic chair watching the nurses I knew all too well scramble back and forth attempting to save his fragile life. I didn't leave his side until he squeezed my hand, winked, and told me to go home and take a shower. After that, I vowed I would never let him leave me alone again. I guess the odds weren't in Mason's favor, for by the time Thanksgiving came around, he was almost a skeleton. But I didn't care. He confided in me that night, accepting the fact that his time was almost up and promising to wait for me on the other side. I begged him not to go, but he just lightly shook his head and rubbed soft circles into my back. He wasn't going to survive to see Christmas. That was 2 months ago. No longer being able to bear to see him hooked up to all sorts of machines, we decided to steal away in the night together. I bundled him up and we drove away in my mother's car until we arrived at an old cabin my family would stay in during the holidays. Mason and I couldn't be any happier. I don't care that I'm on the news every night or that every cop in the county is looking for me. All I care about is being with Mason forever. Even if his flesh is crawling with maggots and beginning to peel off his bones, even if the smell of his rotting cadaver never fades from my skin, his lips are still warm at night and he often whispers sweet secrets into my ear before we sleep. No one, not the police, doctors, or anyone else can ever separate us. I'm ready for them when they come. I made sure to bring the sharpest scalpel I could find when we left the hospital. But until then, I'll lay in Mason's arms, or at least what I think were once his strong appendages, and we'll talk all night until he takes me away. We'll be together forever. I awoke that night to Echo, my dog, barking up a storm. He was perched on the edge of my bed, facing the door, and yapping away like crazy. I scratched him behind the ear to get him to calm down and guided him to his usual spot on my bed. In hindsight, him barking was the first warning. My brain, overactive as it is, was curious as to why he was behaving so oddly. Echo rarely barked at anything, so it was unlikely he was barking at nothing. Perhaps there is a skunk in the yard, I thought to myself. Seeing as how I was half asleep at the time, that explanation seemed perfectly logical. Had I been more aware, I would have realized that any skunks in the neighborhood would be weeks into their hibernation at this time of year. Even if they weren't, the vicious snowstorm outside would deter them from wandering about. I attempted to fall asleep after that, and how I wished that I did. Unfortunately, due to my habit of sleeping with my mouth open, I was becoming increasingly aware of how thirsty I was. I tried to stay in the warmth of my bed for as long as possible, but it wasn't long before my tongue felt like sandpaper. It was clear to me that I wouldn't be able to sleep without a glass of water. I told Echo to stay and slipped into my moccasins. The air outside my nest of blankets was freezing, so I put on my housecoat as well. When I left my bedroom, I noticed that the basement television was showing static. Mother probably forgot to turn it off after watching her murder mysteries, I thought. The TV's playing static because of the storm outside. It's just messing with our cable. Another logical explanation, which would be far less logical if I were fully awake. My mother, no matter how tired she was, would never leave the television on. She's far too meticulous to do something like that. In my sleepy brain, however, it made perfect sense. I couldn't find the TV remote as the room was dark, and I didn't want to accidentally blind myself by turning on the lights, so I left the TV on. I should have turned back, crawled back into bed, and waited for morning. I climbed the stairs to the landing, which was bathed in an orange glow, cast by the streetlights reflecting off the clouds above. From here, I could hear the wind battering itself against the house's walls. I was starting to wake up a little bit. I noticed that the deadbolt on the door was unlocked. That was my final warning. My parents felt that it wasn't necessary, what with the storm and all. The seeds of doubt began to form in my mind. I knew that wasn't the case. Some new neighbors have been suspected of breaking into people's houses and stealing their liquor. My parents, being collectors of fine wines, have made it a habit to lock the deadbolt every night for the past few months, even when the act was completely pointless. My conscious brain was starting to wake up, starting to notice these things. A feeling of uneasiness began to pool in my gut. Still, after locking the deadbolt, I continued to the kitchen. From the kitchen, I had a clear view of the living room, and while I filled an empty glass with water from the sink, I not only noticed that the television up here was also showing static, but there was a figure seated on the couch. Don't worry, I thought nervously, that's just Dad. He's been sleepwalking again. This time, I was fully aware of the flaws inside this logical explanation. The fact that the figure on the couch was bald and plump, while my dad is lean and his hair is only just beginning to thin. The fact that my father has been taking medications to prevent his sleepwalking. The fact that I could hear him snoring from my parents' bedroom. I tried to disregard those thoughts, to push them to the back of my mind like I had done before. This time, it didn't work. I gently set my glass on the kitchen counter. My hands were cold and clammy, shaking in terror. My heart rate was increasing and my breathing was rapid. Even in the confusion of the moment, I knew that this wasn't just some regular burglar. I doubted that the thing on the couch was even human. I reached for the phone to call 911, only to find out that I couldn't get any service due to the storm. Frustrated and confused, I started randomly pushing buttons on the keypad. That's when I heard the thing move. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold and send clammy sweat down my back. It was the sound of bones popping. Not just a few either, it sounded like an entire room full of people cracking their necks, backs, and knuckles all at once. I turned from the useless phone to look at the creature for the first time. It was now standing, facing me and illuminated by the orange glow from the living room's window. It stood at about 6 feet tall, was completely naked, and was rather plump. Its skin was a sallow grayish color, and it looked almost slimy. The creature's arms dangled as if they were boneless, and at the end of each was a gnarled mess of fingers. The worst part about the creature, however, was its face. The thing had no nose, only 2 slits where its nostrils should be. Its eyes were hollow, white orbs that seemed too large for the rest of its face. As for its mouth, well, it didn't really have one. It looked as if its entire lower jaw had been knocked clean off the rest of its face, leaving a swollen pink tongue hanging against its neck. The creature started walking towards me, making that awful sound with each step. It looked like it was trying to speak to me, but without its jaw, the tongue could only wiggle around helplessly as sinister moans escaped its throat. I did what anyone else would do in this situation. I ran like hell. When I got to the landing, I closed the door between the landing and the first floor. I had 3 options. I could surrender myself to the creature, I could run downstairs, which would eventually lead to a dead end, or I could run outside and face one of the worst blizzards of the decade. None of my choices were desirable, but I knew that I'd be dead anyway if I kept standing there. I didn't get much time to choose though, as the door between me and the creature swung open, revealing that thing in all its grotesque glory. It began to descend the stairs towards me. I made my decision, and as stupid as it was, I wouldn't be alive if I hadn't done it. I unlocked the deadbolt and ran outside. For the first few seconds, I felt absolutely nothing save for the adrenaline and fear surging through me. Looking back at the house as I ran, I swear I could see the creature looking at me through the kitchen window. It looked almost happy. By the time my house faded into the blizzard, the cold was starting to set in. Wearing only pajamas, slippers, and a housecoat, it wasn't hard to see why. I continued running in fear that the thing would chase me, but I was starting to go numb. By the time I reached the highway, I couldn't feel my fingers. By the time I noticed the approaching headlights, I couldn't feel my toes. By the time the vehicle had stopped in front of me, everything was starting to go black. I awoke several hours later to the sound of a machine beeping. At first, I thought the whole thing was a nightmare, that I was back in my bed and that my alarm clock was telling me to wake up and go to school. I began to regain consciousness and realized that I was no longer wearing my pajamas. Rather, I was wearing a hospital gown. There was a nurse standing above me, checking my vitals. Apparently, a tow truck driver had found me on his way to a job. He did what anyone else would do if they found a teenager running like hell in the middle of a snowstorm at midnight and rushed me to a nearby hospital. I was admitted to the ER with severe frostbite and a moderate case of hypothermia. My parents were contacted immediately, and at first, it seemed like I was going to go back home again. That is, until the doctors asked why I was outside in my pajamas in the first place. I told them the story, as I couldn't think of any excuse that sounded less crazy. As one might expect, I was shipped off to a psych ward. That is where I'm typing this now. See, the doctors can come up with any number of logical explanations. They can tell me that I was hallucinating, that I was having a nightmare, that I was overstressed. With a medical degree, one can explain any unnatural phenomena with enough pills and prescriptions. But just because an explanation is logical doesn't mean that it's true. At first, I believed what they were saying. At first, it all made sense. But something happened later in the day that changed that. I was reading a book in my bed, starting to come to terms with what had happened, when the TV in my room flickered to life. It was showing static. Outside the window, I could see a grey figure outside the hospital. Even though I was on the 4th floor, I could tell that it was looking directly at me.